Well, on a very different note, we're asking the question, are fears of cancel culture killing the arts and cultural world? This week we saw a number of stories of writers and artists either speaking out against cancel culture or becoming victims of it. Firstly, award-winning Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie penned a scathing essay on her website on Wednesday, where she decried the impact of social media, fashionable cultural orthodoxies, and cancel culture and how it contributes to a kind of ideological conformity amongst young people. Her essay has been shared widely and sparked significant discussion of freedom of expression, artistic and literary censorship, and a wider censorious cultural trend. Chimamanda's letter comes in the same week wherein the Royal Academy pulled artist Jess de Wahls' work from a gift shop over her allegedly transphobic views. They claim that Jessie was in conflict with their values based on a 2019 blog where she wrote that she criticised she criticized the whole idea of kind of gender identity and stated that a woman is an adult human female and not an identity or feeling. She stated that I cannot accept people's unsubstantiated assertions that they are the opposite sex that they were born to. On Thursday, however, the Royal Academy issued an online statement saying that it had received complaints for selling works by an artist expressing transphobic views. It added that her work will not be stocked in future and thanked those who had complained about it. The statement on Instagram added, the Royal Academy is committed to equality, diversity and inclusion and does not knowingly support artists who act in conflict with these values. We would like to reiterate that we stand with LGBT plus people, LGBTQ plus community. So essentially what is going on in the arts and cultural world? Do the art and cultural world still value free speech? Or maybe we're seeing an overdue realignment where the balance of power is tilting towards those who are previously underrepresented and marginalised? Well, this is kind of the question we're asking this morning. We're joined by art consultant and curator Manik Govinda. Thank you for joining us, Manik. I mean, the first question I want to ask you is, do you think that the art and cultural sector has a free speech problem?
Absolutely, it does. I think what's going on in the cultural sector is less tolerant. It's not open to dissident or different ideas and points of view. So what we're finding in many of the kind of particularly publicly funded institutions or museums and galleries is this kind of growing kind of almost conservatism of a different nature, where other points of view are either suppressed or censored or not talked about, and artists that may put a counter-positional points, are being silenced. And as we see Jess de Wahls and Adichie, the kind of backlash that these two very good women artists are facing is a kind of real kind of shrill voice of intolerance. It doesn't matter what their position is on issues around women's rights or trans women's rights. It just feels that this is a silencing of different points of view, which is not good for art and not good for the cultural sector at all.
I mean, Manik, for a lot of people, this will be surprising. I mean, when we think about artists in the cultural sector, we think about, challenging orthodoxy, questioning received wisdom. What is driving this kind of censorious atmosphere, do you think?
Well, that's a complex question, I think. Certainly the arts are seen to be cutting edge, radical, progressive, and certainly in my experience, I've worked in the arts sector for over 35 years, and certainly, the arts have a social awareness about underrepresentation of artists based on sex or gender or race, and I've been at the forefront to redress those imbalances. But when that becomes part of the message, not just about addressing equality of opportunity, it starts to lead to a very an art that becomes quite self-righteous, and it becomes very high-handed, which becomes a sense of that they are more virtuous with their points of view, whether that is around race, or whether that is around queer identity, and it becomes, you know, the idea that it's supposed to be inclusive actually becomes ironically exclusive, because if you have a different point of view, whether that is around gender, or whether that is around race, or whether that is around Brexit, for example, or whether that is you know, politics that may not be part of the kind of progressive norm, then you are sidelined. And we've seen many artists who have been cancelled, writers who've been vilified. So I think, you know, it is worrying that you've got this new generation of creative people who almost like a sort of a Maoist or Stasi kind of thought police, that they are wanting to control your thought and freedom of expression, rather than having a dialogue with it, disagreeing, and, you know, be robust about that disagreement by all means. The arts should be a healthy, open space for creative as well as intellectual conversations on difference.
I wonder, Manik, though, I mean, does the artist community not have a responsibility to not inflame tensions between kind of vulnerable minority groups, the trans community, for example? You know, should there not be some, you know, there needs to be some protection for those people who are kind of, you know, vulnerable groups, and sort of deliberately provocative art feels like it inflames a tension that we don't really need?
Well, I think provocative art is important in all territories. We've seen it, you know, in the centuries, from modernism to expressions and so forth. That, you know, it can cause, it will provoke, and certainly when an artist like Jess de Wahls, whose work is, yes, you know, she's got a strong feminist position. But it's not an offensive position. I certainly have read her blog and I've seen her work, and she represents a work that is about a very women-centered kind of perspective. And what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that. That's not provoking or triggering some kind of an offence or something to people who may not agree with her. I can't see what is offensive about her work. I think it asks questions, it provokes, it certainly handles difficult subject matter like domestic violence, for example. So I can't see what, and so it is comfortable but offensive. I don't think so. We need to kind of just be tougher skinned about that. The arts community, you know, it's a wide spectrum, and it should be celebrated for the diversity, absolutely. But to silence other artists who make work about another subject that people don't like is censorship. That's that. You know, let's just call it for what it is. It's almost censorship along the lines of fascism or totalitarian communism.
No. So one last question very quickly. I mean, what advice would you give to a young artist who wants to create art as freely as possible and is finding it uncomfortable or stifling many of these traditional artistic and cultural institutions and spaces?
It's very difficult for young artists, I think, who don't fit into the zeitgeist. And certainly some artists I know would remain anonymous about their points of view, about some of the work that they might make under pseudonyms, for example. And I think the kind of shrillness and the witch hunt culture, in particular on social media platforms, can destroy someone's career. You know, particularly if you're an emerging career artist, you may be completely sidelined by the institutions, particularly. I think what I would say is that we do need to be more courageous and brave, and build alternative spaces and alternative platforms. If the main institutions are going to sideline provocative art and counterpositional practices, then we need to kind of start looking at our own, creating our own spaces, looking at
fascinating stuff, Manik.
That's underground and exciting.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us, Manik Govinda,